Greetings, comrades. Bienvenidos, compañeros. Willkommen, Kameraden. I got 3 languages today. What do you think of that? Are you impressed? I'm not. I'm definitely not impressed. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us this week on Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We have something really special lined up for this week and next week. We have another collaborative episode coming straight into your ear hole, straight into your mind hole, whatever that is, your third eye, coming right into your pineal gland. Oh, we're starting off strong today, aren't we? Well, coming at you, we have an excellent discussion with myself, Comrade Adam, and a very new comrade and fellow podcaster in the leftosphere, Neil, from the From78 podcast. Neil reached out to us, and it became very clear, very fast, that we have a lot of similar interests, a lot of similar ideas in politics, Marxism, psychoanalysis, history, philosophy, all that sort of shit. So we thought, hey, why not? Let's just do a podcast together. Hey, let's maybe do a bunch of podcasts together. So this episode you're going to be hearing today is actually in the format of From78. So it might be a little different. We're not focusing on any particular text, but so much of the conversation overlaps with what we normally cover here on Red Library. We wanted to make sure we bring it to you, our comrade listeners out there across the globe, because we think you're going to enjoy it. And also, it's going to help direct your attention and intentions over to Comrade Neil's podcast, again, which is called From78. You'll be able to find some links to a way to listen to that, and also a way to find his Patreon page if you'd like to start supporting him as well. We're going to jump right into the episode. Again, this is part 1. Part 2 is going to be coming at you next week. And in the meantime, please remember to keep supporting Red Library in the numerous ways that we offer. Number 1, please make sure you keep giving us those iTunes reviews. Go down to the bottom of your podcast catcher page, click on some stars, maybe write us a review. We got some new ones since last week, so big shout out to y'all for leaving those. We read them, we pondered over them, we were very humbled. We appreciate you. Head over to our Patreon page and throw us a few bucks if you'd like to support the show that way. We have our next Patreon exclusive episode probably coming out in the next few weeks. We're not going to tell you what it's about, but you can be expecting a preview coming your way very soon. Remember to follow us on Facebook, find our Twitter page, and in general, just keep spreading the show around. That is the most helpful thing if you want to support us at the moment. All right, y'all, we're going to catch you here afterward for a few closing comments, but in the meantime, here's me and Comrade Neil from the From78 podcast talking about Hauntology, Dialectical Pessimism, and a whole lot more. Enjoy. Peace.
So this is the From78 podcast, and I am From78, and today I am sitting down and talking with Comrade Adam, and I'm going to let Comrade Adam introduce himself, because talking about other people at the beginning of a podcast is something that I'm just not that good at. So Comrade Adam, why don't you talk about yourself, what you do, why you do it, and anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, well, again, my name is Adam. I go by Comrade Adam on Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. So that is a leftist theory and political history and organizing show that I've been running since about January, that I started mostly to just satisfy some weird perverse urge that I have to just talk about this kind of stuff nonstop. And it's that way I don't terrorize other people in my life who just don't give a damn about any of it. I'm also a clinical social worker. I work at a local nonprofit here in Austin, Texas, focused on literacy for low-income adults and their families. Yeah, I work a lot in my practice with survivors of violence and trauma, which has a lot of strange and really interesting overlap with my political perspective and what I'm interested in. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. That's pretty much me day to day. I have 2 cats. One of them might jump up and get a little obnoxious in the recording, so we'll see how that goes.
What are the cats' names?
So one of them is named Syria, and then the other one is Bitsa, and we call her B. So B is probably the one who's going to decide to incur upon our recording here.
Got it. That's cool. I've had cats make appearances and dogs make appearances when I've tried to record before, and I actually think it kind of like endears people. oddly, to a podcast
it's
when they hear that stuff.
Yeah, it's strangely humanizing. It's like, oh, I'm not just some I'm not living in a bunker somewhere just surrounded by like Marxist theory books. I actually have a life, funny enough. So
okay, cool. So the way that I like to kind of start these things off is this is going to be really easy talking to you because you're probably really familiar with the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx, says that there is this specter that is haunting Europe, and it is a specter of communism. And that became kind of my starting point. I thought of this podcast one day because I was reading The Specters of Marx, the Derrida book, and he was talking, about hauntology and haunting. As I continued to think about it more, I started to think about how there are ghosts from our past that are haunting us. Yeah. And I kind of took that idea from Mark Fisher, I think. And then there are specters from our future that are haunting us. And so what I like to open up with is, from your perspective, doing the things that you do, living the life that you've lived, what would you say are the ghosts that are haunting, the things that you're doing? And what would you say are the specters that are haunting the things that you're doing?
I'm so excited to talk about this question because Fisher and Derrida, these are huge influences on my thinking. And, not just some disembodied intellectual sort of way of thinking about larger political problems, but, in a very deeply visceral, psychological sort of way. So yes, this is right up my alley. In terms of what ghosts haunt my life and have haunted my life, I was thinking about this a lot over the last couple of weeks. And whenever I think about larger political, historical events, I think the obvious one, and I know a past guest on your show talked about it, is obviously 9/11. And being in high school, starting high school right whenever the event happened, it's one of those things that gets sort of ingrained in your memory of what it was like whenever you saw the videos. And I was sitting in my cafeteria in my high school. So I think that one is something that still haunts my day-to-day experience. Recently I was coming back into the States from a trip to Spain with my spouse, and it was really shocking to see the sort of ghost of this like militarized, low intensity, low grade police state that, is something that still reverberates. And it was almost shocking to me as someone who is political and sort of focused on this stuff as I am, would still be so, I don't want to say the word immune, but you forget how much that has changed and how much that history still lives with us, and this sort of opening up of this like terror of just violence of the other that could incur at any time. And so it was shocking to me to be like, wow, even though I think about this shit all the time, God, even I have forgotten how much that changed.
Yeah, one of the things that has come up in conversations I've done with people is the ghost of 9/11. It's come up repeatedly. Yeah. And what I'm noticing, and I don't exactly know how to articulate this, so I'm kind of working this out in real time here. People who tend to be on the left, they have this, experience of 9/11, and it's a meaningful experience. It's a very haunting experience. It's something that for many of them, I would say is formative, but it isn't formative in the way that it seems to be portrayed, I think, kind of in general kind of culture, right? The way that I think about how people will talk about 9/11 as this thing that haunts them and kind of drives them closer to this kind of performative patriotism and those sorts of things. And people on the left, that isn't, I guess in a sense you could say that is something that happens to them, but in another sense you could say it's not. And I'm really curious, having lived through that, being somebody who is committed to, leftist causes and taking those leftist causes and not making them just kind of like these abstract things that people think and write about, but taking them and making them into like real material changes in the real world. How do you see the event of 9/11 and the way that it haunts you affecting that, the way that you are a leftist in the world today?
Yeah, well, I think this is such a great question. To me, I think it made my starting point anti-imperialism. And, that word gets thrown around and it's a huge, almost like apora, I guess, in the left now. All these conversations about the thing that the left lacks is a strong internationalist, anti-imperialist framework. And I think I agree with that to a certain extent. I also don't agree with it as if it's the same exact thing that Lenin would have talked about 100 years ago. It both is and is not at the same time. So maybe we could talk about what that means if it's of interest. But to me, I think the initial starting point was the just complete catastrophic horror of watching this military invasion starting to unfold right in front of your eyes. And, I was recently talking with a guest on our show, Professor Jason Brownlee, who's written a lot about Middle Eastern politics and authoritarianism and Egypt and American intervention, or American invasion, is what it actually should be called. But we had a whole discussion about, whenever the Iraq War was revving up and the huge protests, the mass movements that arose internationally in opposition to it. And yet at the end of the day, the invasion still happened. And I think that, to me, this is sort of a weird, almost kind of eerie thing I don't even know how to articulate myself, is what is the impact and what has the impact been on people on the left to see that despite the largest mass movements in history at the time, this sort of international solidarity and sympathy that we had, as people of the United States from all over the world, that yet at the same time, the forces of capital and white supremacy and however else you want to describe them, American imperialism, still at the end of the day just steamed forward with nothing stopping it. That despite all those mass movements, it didn't stop it. And to me, I think that is a deeply tragic and sort of ghostly thing that haunts us now. And right now, as we speak, with mass movements happening in Chile, in Lebanon, these sort of arisings that I was almost thinking about this, that, it's right around 50 years since May 68, another period of international uprisings and mass movements. And yet at the same time, those ebbed and people went back to work, the barricades went down and capital kept marching forward. So I don't know. I mean, these are a lot of things I think a lot about myself, and I'm trying to figure out, how do these affect us? And maybe for me, I think part of it is sort of a disenchantment with the idea that some spontaneous mass movement will be the answer.
Yeah. As you say that, one of the things that kind of comes into my own mind is the way that kind of Freud haunts my own thoughts when I think about this stuff, right?
Oh yeah, and rightly so. There's a reason why I have a Sigmund Freud bobblehead on my office desk where I do therapy, and I feel like I need his specter, I need his ghost there all the time. So
yeah, it's like with that incident in particular, though, right? It's there's this display that could be described as just this explosion of aggressive drive, and what could have happened, right? I think is what you were talking about a little bit ago here. Solidarity, where people could have said like that's not good. What's going on here? How do we want to respond to this thing? And they did, but the way that they responded was, in like kind. It was more just kind of like a complete and total, seemingly like breakdown of the ways that human beings have kind of used culture and government and politics and a whole bunch of other really complicated social technologies to kind of sublimate some of their drives, right?
Yeah.
And it just goes nuts. One of the people who I thought a lot about during that time, and this is one of those specters or ghosts, really, I guess, because I think of ghosts as people from the past that continues to haunt my thought, is Rosa Luxemburg.
Yeah.
And the way that what she was enduring in Poland, and the way that it led to her tragically losing her life, being killed, and all that for refusing to go along with this kind of like unsublimated drive towards violence and whatnot. And I say it haunts me because, I like Rosa Luxemburg a lot, but I don't want to look at her as the right about everything. I think that there are some real, for me anyways, things in her writing that I look at, and I look at them with suspicion, and I think like, I'm not so sure about this. But in regards to her commitment to having a revolution that didn't entail, some kind of like mass militarization, I'm definitely all for that. I'm curious what you might think about this.
It's, I feel like some of the same questions that she was critical of Lenin about, and some of those debates still haunt us. Whenever I start unraveling this idea about who are the ghosts that haunt me, the failed German Revolution of 1917, 1918, and precisely the sort of larger historical events that led to Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht being murdered, those are still ghosts that haunt us today. Not only just me individually, but through this sort of larger communal social practice of leftist politics. I mean, one of the most important things I think that reading people like Mark Fisher and like Derrida and this sort of approach has really brought me to consider strongly and be very critical of is how these larger historical failures haunt the entire leftist political quadrant, or, whatever the hell that is. The same questions about workers' councils and, spontaneous mass movements and the need for a party, or dare I say, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which, these questions are so actively debated. And there's this deeply melancholic attachment to a lot of these things. And I don't even think it necessarily requires a sort of in-depth understanding of the history of these questions necessarily to really kind of like pull you into that sort of attachment to these sort of ghosts, and to in some ways be arrested in whatever new ways of thinking about them that we could have. So in terms of like a militarization, yeah, I think this is absolutely still an ever-present question and sort of fear. I've interviewed a number of DSA members for my show. And one of the things that you kind of always find is that there's this deep sort of fear about the idea of a militarized sort of approach to sort of radical revolutionary social change. And I've also seen people that I've organized with who find examples of that, like maybe going on in India or in Nepal or wherever it might be. And this idea that, well, that is obviously the answer. Like we should just throw ourselves into that. And it's sort of a frustration with everyone else who doesn't see that as being the immediate solution. So, to me, I think that those answers, those ghosts still haunt me very much about those exact same questions. And yeah, to me, it's almost as if, there's just layer upon layer of these ghosts that haunt us. I mentioned May 68. I still think about that all the time. And I guess the more I've learned the history behind leftist politics, the more it feels almost like I find more and more ghosts that I'm just inviting into my life. And it feels like what needs to be done. It also feels that it makes it much more complicated and much more difficult to figure out what the hell is to be done today.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times that's the thing about ghosts, right? They can be annoying because they can fill you with doubt and anxiety and different things, but at the same time, their presence, I think, can really be nice in a certain way, right? Like the inviting those ghosts into your life is something that can be, I would say, rather productive because it can they can give you pause. You know what I mean? And for me, I think that's really good, right? Like I know that when my blood runs hot. That's the time where I think that the ghosts kind of get drowned out, and that's probably when it becomes really more important to not do that, right? To really try, if I can, to engage in that, to turn up the haunting as opposed to let the anger turn it down.
I think that's a really beautiful way to say that. Yeah, I would very much agree. I think that it's almost whenever I feel like I get into these frustrating deadlocks in actual political organizing work, it almost seems as if that's the time to, as Nigel Tufnell from Spinal Tap would say, it's like turn it up to 11. It's like the hauntings need to go as high as possible precisely in that moment to figure out how to orient yourself in those exact struggles. I think you're dead on about that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know I had this recently. I was at a meeting where people were talking about the current Democratic primary was one of the things that was coming up, right? And it's this idea that, if you don't support this candidate, then you don't get it, whoever you are. They use that in the most general sense. And there was other people there. I was in this other group that was saying now, hold on a second. I don't know, but that's actually a really great organizing strategy to come at people, with the way that you just did. You know what I mean? You're in a room of people who are on your side, dude. And you're already kind of aggro. So how's this going to come across if you try to engage somebody who is maybe not, they might be kind of on the fence politically, but if you come at them being kind of like this stereotypical angry leftist or something like that, I don't know, but that's going to help. And at the same time, it's like bring the passion. That's good. And bring the commitment. I think that's also good. But if you let those things drown out the ghosts, then, I think that we end up walking into a pretty bad situation that we could avoid if we just, I think, had that capacity to kind of just tune in. You know what I mean? Let the ghosts, let the specters do their thing. Have your little momentary seance or something like that, and see what comes up.
Well, it's interesting that you talked about that example of being the stereotypical like aggro, angry leftist who's just yelling at everybody in the room because they haven't read What Is to Be Done by Lenin or something like that. I think maybe a really personal ghost for me that intersects with a lot of the political work and what we do on the show even is not a particular person, I would say, but just sort of my background growing up. I grew up in a very conservative, very, very conservative to say the least, town. My family was very, very conservative in a lot of ways. And in some sense, the ghost that I kind of always feel like is walking right next to me is this former version of myself who was like on the opposite end of the political spectrum. And I feel like whenever I'm engaging and thinking about things politically, especially in terms of real day-to-day organizing and talking with people, I always ask myself, would this be the thing that I would have been open to hearing 15 years ago? Would I have been responsive to that? And I think that, to me, it's one of those ghosts that I think is very productive to always ask myself, like with my family members, a lot of my family members are very, right-wing. And I don't shy away from talking about politics and my political positions. And I always ask myself, those people like haunt me in this very productive way, because it always sort of puts a check on my whatever tendency I might have to be some like aggro, angry leftist just yelling at everyone all the time about this shit.
Yeah, this is kind of a weird segue, but when I think about that, when I think about the angry leftist thing, kind of trope, I guess. I work in a university, and the kind of angry leftist that I'm thinking of when I say that a lot of times is the sort of like woker than thou leftist who is saying like, if you don't support somebody because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation or whatever, it's almost as if those sorts of like that style of identity politics becomes a thing that people really care about. Sometimes oftentimes, in fact, I think they care more about that than they do about like actual policy type stuff. But that's the thing there. It's just like, and if you don't support this person, it's actually because you either are consciously or unconsciously a racist, a sexist, somebody who hates this particular individual or this group of people or hates this identity or something like that. And that's the thing that I see that kind of shutting down a lot of conversations, right? Because there's a way you can have those. I really believe there's a way you can have that kind of conversation with another person and have it not kind of just fall into this pit of a kind of like micro level version of what we were talking about, maybe just at the beginning of the show, where your drive force has come up and just kind of want to play and dominate this other person into submission, and if you don't do that, at least you get them to just kind of like walk away. And I, as I say this, I know I'm being really critical of the left. I want to be really clear about one thing. People on the right do the same thing too. So I don't want to, only say that this is like angry leftists. There's angry people on the right. What I think would be kind of really productive for anybody, depending on, where they fall along a political continuum, is to just sort of have that time where you do what you were saying. You check in with that previous version of yourself. You check in with your ghosts, whatever they are, and try to use that to inform the thinking that you're doing and the acting that you're doing at the same time.
As someone who also exists in the realm of social work and went through a social work school that was, very, very liberal. To me, I think a lot of those sorts of things are symptomatic of a particular set of assumptions that underlie those types of politics. Speaking of, ghosts that haunt us in this sort of realm, I think about the ghosts of the way that democratic liberal politics has sort of shaped particular conversations around identity and around what power is and how power plays out and a sense of agency and purpose in your life, and how those things are so severely constricted within the structures of capital and the relations of capitalist production that, to me, I think that we will find a sense of power and a sense of control if we don't have that in our lives, which I think is what a lot of people on the left don't have. And it's what drives us to a lot of this sort of perspective on the world, that it doesn't remove that sense of wanting to feel a sense of power and agency in your life. And I think that a lot of times what I've seen in that sort of ID poll, like identity politics sort of approach, has been a lot of things that I guess I would describe as being very idealized. The idea that political change and power solely exists in the realm of ideas and the inner states of consciousness someone has. And also in the larger political goals that you are hoping to achieve through engaging in that kind of like political discourse, or, more often than not, it's a lack thereof. like, for example, a lot of those types of discussions, I think, are very much focused on representation. And the goal is to have a sort of broader array of like people represented within certain institutions as they exist. And I think that a lot of times those sorts of institutions thrive and absolutely know how to incorporate these desires for representation within their functioning themselves. I mean, this is a pretty, cliche kind of argument here, but you see these articles about, like the head of the CIA is now a woman, and like we're making really, really substantial progress in terms of gender relations. And it's that, and the woman who's in charge of the CIA is like, the torturer in chief is essentially what they are. And like they absolutely are contributing to the just complete global levels of devastation and environmental devastation that the U.S. military and the military-industrial complex contributes to. So I think part of the reason why we don't have those like larger policy sorts of perspectives is almost because the nature of the discourse itself obscures any kind of focus on that. It's almost like you don't consider that because it's not really. It's almost like those things aren't accounted for in the discourse itself, because then we'd have to talk about structural power. And I don't think those discourses are interested in that. So
for sure. As you're saying that, one of the things that happens to me a lot, and this is another one thing, I haven't really thought of it a whole lot here. I'm working this out as I talk, but there'll be times where I find myself thinking primarily within the confines of like, what are the material conditions here? What are the real world things that are happening to real people in terms of, access to things and stuff that they need. And I'll get really into that. And then what will happen is like the ghost of idealism sort of comes up. and that's
a hell of a ghost. Yeah. The ghost of idealism. Yeah.
It's like, hey, you can create really awesome policy and you can do a bunch of different things. But, if people don't buy into this really, like in their own hearts and minds, it probably won't be that effective. And it kind of reminds me of the importance of engaging in that style, right? And likewise, there's times where I'll go deeply into, what is it that people, you talked about it, I think you said the intersections, interpsychic intersections. I don't remember exactly what you said, but I liked it.
Well, who knows? We'll have to listen on the playbacks. I already forgot what I said. So.
Yeah, that makes sense to me because it's like there's things happening in people's heads. And they have values, they have ideals, they have things that matter to them. And these are things that exist in the realm of thought. And they have they control the way that people, I think, the way that people think and feel about the material conditions. And so, it seems to me that really you have to take a binocular view here, right? You have to look at things from like an idealist perspective where you really are considering the hearts, the minds, the ideas that people are engaging with in a meaningful way. And you do absolutely have to consider, the material conditions that people are in, because if they don't have, if people are really, really, really stressed out because they truly don't have the things that they need, they're not going to have time to consider, different things. They're not going to have time to think about stuff in new and interesting ways because they're going to be so caught up in just trying to, make it work on a day-to-day basis. So that's been one of the things that's really interesting. When I get really interested in, reading Derrida or Adorno or high theory or something like that, it's like, okay, this is really great. And I love this and I want to talk about it and think about it and reflect on it and write about it. And I'm not as concerned about the material conditions of people. And likewise, when I go out and I'm engaging in trying to change the material conditions that people find themselves living in, the idealist stuff will come back out again too. I don't know. Do you have anything like that happen for you?
I mean, every single moment of every single day.
The dialectic.
Yeah, I mean, there it is. There's our buzzword of the day is dialectic. I think that at the risk of sidestepping, answering this, maybe more substantively, I guess I would say I think it's dialectical. So that it is. It's always this sort of like totality of the material conditions and the ideal sort of aspects and how those play in to each other at any given time. I mean, to me, I guess one of the things that I guess is important whenever I think about a more just strictly idealist approach is I'll just refer back to a really common point that Slavoj Žižek makes about ideology, that in some ways, many of the ways that ideology functions now is it doesn't actually require us to have a conscious buying in or sense of meaning and purpose in social relations in any sort of way. And the example he always gave was that if I go to Mass on Sunday and, take the Eucharist, in some ways, I don't have to believe in any of that, but I still go. I still participate in the material conditions of that practice and that institution perpetuating itself. So to me, I think these are things that whenever I'm involved in a lot of like political organizing work, in terms of like the high theory, it's where I'm almost like wanting to push the idealist sort of aspect of the dialectic a little bit further to say we have to think really critically and we have to learn about these sort of, you know, maybe like very high theory sorts of ways of thinking about this, but it's important to bring those into how we think about it and to bring those into the equation, because if we don't, we risk in some ways contributing to the institutions and social relations of capital perpetuating themselves in a much more sort of tight-knit, sort of more challenging way to even understand. And we contribute to what, you know, in cybernetics you would call negative feedback loop. It's almost like our resistance to it is precisely the thing that's going to allow it to continue. And to me, you know, a lot of those theorists like Adorno and all these folks, I mean, these are ghosts that haunt me too. And this idea of this like disembodied high theory idealist sort of practice is a ghost, but it is always a productive one for me, because the material conditions are so overwhelming and so powerful. Mm-hmm. The temptation to just say, well, let's just focus on the material and let's just get something done. Let's see some sort of result that'll make things better is so deeply enticing and powerful that you have to find some way to counteract that.
Yeah, you know, you did I think you're still doing it. You're working your way through one of Foucault's lectures on your show?
Yeah, we actually have the final lecture coming out next week. So the week after we record this today, yeah.
Yeah, and those have been really, really great. I've read that, and I've loved listening to you, and I can't remember the name of your interlocutor right now.
Oh, that's Comrade Commissar Don is his handle, yeah.
Yeah, all right, there we go. Comrade Commissar Don. Listening to you talk about that has been really great, because Foucault is one of those, this is a major ghost in my life.
Oh, I was totally agree with that, yeah.
You know, because in like one of the other podcasts I listened to is Why Theory, the one that Todd McGowan does.
I absolutely love. I was going to plug that so hard today to just be like, please go listen to that show. That show is incredible.
It's really, really good in ways that I wish I could be that good. You know what I mean? But be that as it may.
Don't we all? Like, they're very good at what they do. Yeah.
Yeah, they really are. But they don't like Foucault. And that's something that comes up, I think, on a regular basis on that show for good reasons. And, you know, one of the things that happens a lot is that, you know, people will say who don't like Foucault, we'll say I'm kind of straw manning the Y theory guys here, which I wish I wasn't doing, but I've started to do it. So I guess I got to follow through here. There's this idea.
Commit to your action.
Yeah. There's this idea, you know, that Foucault says that you can't escape power. You know, that there are power dynamics in the world, period. And there is no way that you get to opt out of that. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And to me, that makes sense. I do think that there are power dynamics in the world. And I think that, you know, I definitely do this. A lot of the people who I know try to do this. I think you try to do this. Recognize the power that I have, that you have, that we have, and then use that power in a way which is more responsible than irresponsible. Be that as it may, you know, there's going to be times where I do use my power in an irresponsible way. There's going to be times where the power that is available to me becomes really, really almost like addictive and alluring. And I end up using it in a way that after the fact, I can look back and go like, oh, that's ugly. I really wish that I didn't do that thing that I did. I absolutely gave in to the throes of power there. And it's pretty, you know, and when I catch myself doing that, I attempt to, you know, do some kind of restitution for it. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. But I see this as just being the way that the world is. I don't think that we can just opt out of power. And I do think that a lot of things really do, that power is always a factor, you know, in everything that is important to me. It's important in the psychotherapeutic work that I do. It's important in the teaching that I do. It's important in the organizing I do. It's important in the interpersonal relationships that I have with friends and family members and all that. And it's just there. And that is something that always like pops up, and it's just like, you know, oh, you're going to abuse power at some point. You're going to abuse, and it's this, that's one of those ghosts which I would classify as kind of annoying, but one of the ghosts that definitely pops up in my own life on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, I think so for me too. You know, it's interesting. I'm feeling like in a very dynamic way, we're talking about these sort of theoretical ghosts, you know, or these figures of theory that haunt us. And I absolutely would say Foucault is a primary one for me. In some ways, I found Foucault and gravitated towards Foucault before I got into like more Marxist leftist sorts of approaches, although I was familiar with that as well. And I think today I can't go a single day without thinking about Foucault's sense of power. And almost to me, it's that it's been one of the most productive ghosts to continue to allow myself to be haunted by and not to disavow it, and to sort of try to repress it. Because to me, it's one of those things that's fairly self-evident that whenever you're actually engaging in relationships and engaging in the workplace, or like if you're involved in a university or in myself and like a nonprofit, these are all questions of power. And to me, the extent to which we would disavow Foucault's ghost is to severely weaken our ability to understand exactly how those things play out. I'm actually really glad that you enjoy the Foucault series, because I know that whenever we started doing it, we definitely had some hesitation to just ask ourselves, like, who in the hell is going to want to listen to this for 11 lectures? But the response that we've had to it, I think, has been really surprising, and we're very humbled and thankful for that, because that book for us was just something that we always wanted to read together, and it became sort of an excuse to finally do it. So I'm really glad to hear that it's hopefully exposing people to Foucault in an in-depth way that hopefully corrects some of the maybe misunderstandings or straw man arguments about Foucault that I think a lot of people on the left have. He's dismissed very easily as being some like proto-neoliberal bourgeois theorist or whatever the hell it is that people say about him. But I find Foucault to be pretty necessary, and sort of you have to engage with him at some point if you want to be on the left today, because his questions and his analysis, I think, is in some ways it's so crucial and fundamental to supplement like a more kind of like let's say orthodox understanding of Marxism. To me, I don't feel like you could be out there doing good organizing work in the situation that we're in today, especially in the U.S., without that ghost haunting you all the time.
It's funny because I teach in a school of social work. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that a lot of I'm teaching in a grad school, so all my students are getting their master's or their doctorate. They've already gone through their bachelor's. A lot of them have maybe heard of Foucault. A lot of them haven't. And even the ones who've heard of him, they haven't read him. And this is one of those things where I really think that the discipline and the profession of social work really, really, really need to get haunted by Foucault much more than they are.
Oh, yeah,
right?
I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to find, one of my things that I'm doing right now is attempting to find ways to kind of work discipline and punish into a social work curriculum. And, it's actually hard to do this because there's a lot of people, who would be teaching courses who haven't read that book. And if you're going to teach a course, you have to read the book.
I don't know. Some of my professors, I'm pretty sure they didn't read the books they were trying to teach, but maybe that's another story.
Totally another story. And I'm with you on that for sure. But I've actually I have more than one copy of that book. And I've loaned out copies of it to people. It's just like, check it out, give it a read, and, come back and we'll talk about how we can use this. Maybe we don't use the whole thing. Maybe we use excerpts or something like that. But let's just figure out some way to use this. And, they read that first chapter with the really, really detailed description, of the execution. Yeah. And they're just like, I cannot imagine having people read this. I'm like, this is but yes, we have to have people read this. Do you think that the argument is that what's going on in our prison system right now, do you think that it's more humane than this? Or is it just now something that we don't see? And that's a really important question to ask. Don't you think we should be asking that question? Shouldn't everybody be haunted by the possibility that the society that we live in is not nearly as advanced or civilized or idealistic as we imagine it to be, in our lives where we don't have to think about these things?
Oh, yeah. All right. We're getting to some good shit right now. So, a couple of things I would say to this. I think one reason why in, let's say, the social work profession, and I would be very curious if you were to talk to people who are like licensed professional counselors or licensed marriage and family therapists, if they also have a huge gap around Foucault, because in some way, our professions, speaking of power, are part of the institutional shift that Foucault's whole project is designed to describe. We are the people who work on the soul, as he would say. We're part of clinics. We're part of these professions that they have this disciplinary sort of approach to them. And I think one of the biggest questions that I talk a lot about, especially in organizing work around social work and unionizing and things like this, is how we have to step back and understand that part of the role of like the social worker as a professional has been to completely buy into this institutional shift to say, yeah, the role of you as the social worker is precisely to police the boundaries of who's in what class, to sort of circumvent or undermine social pressures, which potentially could eventually lead to like mass riots and mass uprisings. I mean, one of the most powerful books I've ever read is actually a book by Piven and Cloward, and it's called Regulating the Poor. And it's essentially a history of the relationship between social welfare policy and social work. And one of the things it describes is how a lot of the reasons why work requirements were tied, and speaking of a ghost that haunts me, this is actually a big one today in my professional life. One of the reasons why work requirements were tied to things like receiving social welfare programs was very consciously and explicitly a strategy that was aimed to undermine civil unrest and like poor and communities of color. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was like a very conscious thing that was done, was to like create a sort of like pressure valve to release that. And I think that today, most social work as we encounter it, and a lot of like therapeutic professions, I think still do sort of, we're haunted by this ghost, but it's one of those ghosts that hasn't even like formulated. It's like this weird spectral entity that we don't even really think about, but we're playing out the effects of it.
Yeah. So as you say that, there's this thing that I launch into this thing very early in every semester when I teach, right? Because I ask students, kind of like, what if you're going to be a social worker? That's a choice. You could have chosen a lot of different stuff, but you chose this. I'm curious what it is that led you to desire to become a social worker as opposed to any of the other things you could do. And people give their various answers, and a lot of it's about desiring to help other people.
Yep.
And I talk about, I push on that. Then I'm like, okay, so there's a lot of other professions that also help other people. What is it about the profession of social work in particular that you think, makes it have the edge in that area? And people give their various answers. And then I do this thing where, the next day I have like 3 or 4 students drop my class because I'll say, if we look at the history of the profession of social work here, I think we could argue that at a certain point, social workers were workers, right? The worker component of the title, that's what they were. I
was just talking with someone about this earlier today, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. They were in solidarity with and members of the working class, right? Mm-hmm. Working classes. That's what they did. They found people, who had boots on their neck. There was this bigger, more powerful institutional force that had a boot on the neck of the working classes. And social workers, I think, tried to ally with those who had the boots on their neck, and they tried to push the people wearing the boots off through a variety of different tactics and technologies and whatnot. But now, what I think has happened, largely since social work has turned into a profession and really kind of libidinally invested in this idea of the professional, is they've gone from being the people who are, helping attack those who wear the boots to being the people who wear the boots. And that social workers now are oftentimes, they're working for hospitals and they're working for different agencies like child welfare agencies and different things. And what they're doing is they're actually opting people out of services. They're telling the people who are right now the working classes adapt and start becoming more of a better servant to capitalism, ultimately. And so what I challenge students to do is to say, do you want to be a social worker or do you want to be a social warden? And I would say that probably when I say that, most people are going to say, well, of course I want to be a social worker. But I'm going to push on that and say, I'm not so sure that that's true, right?
Yeah.
I think that realistically, in a room full of however many people, there are some people that, if we're being honest, actually desire more to be wardens and less to be workers. It's easier to be a warden. It's, you get more power when you're a warden. You have more security when you're a warden. When you're a worker, you are opting into a vulnerable population, especially in this stage of late capitalism here in the United States. So really think about that. And what I'm trying to do in that is to get sort of the ghost of social workers past, emphasis on workers, to kind of haunt the students that I have. And I think that some don't want that. Like I said, they end up dropping the class. And some really take to it, which is very great. I think when that happens, it's great for me. I don't know if it's great for other people, but I enjoy it. And whatnot. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to you.
No, I mean, I appreciate that greatly, because I think that, while not working at a university as a professor, I sort of supervise social work interns who are in bachelor or graduate level programs. And in some ways, I feel like I do a very similar thing, which is to say, okay, you come in here and you tell me that you want to help people. Well, if you're going to do that, you need to understand a couple of key ghosts that you have to reckon with those ghosts to figure out how you're going to answer this question of what is this going to look like for you. And so this sort of history of like social workers past and how at different points social workers were defined as workers and allied with their clients and with vulnerable populations and the poor and the oppressed and marginalized and exploited. And that ghost has to be in that conversation. Another one, God, I don't even know how to even talk about this one, but one ghost I think about quite a bit in terms of social work in the nonprofit world and in like philanthropy is the ghost of the Ludlow massacre. Mm-hmm. And I've talked about this on the show of where, there were a bunch of striking workers and their families out in Ludlow, Colorado against, I think it was a plant that was owned by Rockefeller. And eventually they were gunned down. They were gunned down by a couple of militia that were basically hired by the Rockefeller company to basically just sit up on a hill and just mow down these people. And part of what led to the birth of philanthropic organizations as we know them was a PR move by the Rockefeller Foundation. Well, basically they created the Rockefeller Foundation to say, listen, we have to correct this image of you as this tyrannical capitalist oppressor. So maybe if we start giving some of your fortune away to these charitable causes, that this will redeem you in the eyes of the public. And most of social work in the nonprofit realm, we all thrive on what is called the nonprofit industrial complex. And the whole genesis of that nonprofit industrial complex, I think in a large way, owes its birth to the Ludlow massacre. Mm-hmm. So for me, I show up in a nonprofit and I kind of think about that pretty often, that, in some ways part of organizations like this, why we even exist, is a response to the just brutal slaying of striking workers and their families. And to me as a social worker, it's that you have to understand the context of that and to understand that part of the ghosts that haunt you being in a particular kind of institution are the ghosts of these workers' struggles, the lives that were lost, the strikes that happened, the violence, the mass violence that occurred. And to me, that's a sort of a strange and tragic ghost that I think haunts the profession, at least as I encounter it today. And I, try to share that with the young social workers that I supervise and try to at least help them ask those questions about those sort of ghosts. Because if you don't, no one is going to point them out to you, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. One of the things that I see coming out of this a lot is, and this maybe can lead us in a new direction here. The way that I describe a lot of the work that I do is dialectical pessimism. And and maybe somebody else used that term. If somebody else is using it and I'm stealing it, I just don't know that, because it seemed to me like I came up with this, though I probably didn't. But when I use those terms, when I'm thinking about, and I talk to students and I talk to other people, LCPCs, marriage and family therapists, people who do pastoral care. I try to talk to a lot of people about this because I do see that there is this very appealing desire to sort of like look at what one does and to be like, oh, look at me. I'm a good social worker. I'm a good mental health person. I'm just a good person, really trying to make a positive difference in the lives of people who are in mm-hmm. conditions that are worse than mine. And I want to lift them up, and I'm committed to this. This is cool. And I feel really good about it. And my reaction is to be like, okay, that all of that is fine. But I have this pessimistic point of view that it's not anywhere near, enough. I take a look at the conditions of the world right now, and I am very dissatisfied with them. I'm not satisfied, right? And so I look at the efforts that I'm doing, and my reaction is, it's not enough. This mm-hmm. is that what I'm doing is it's a drop in a bucket, and it's probably not going to have that much of an impact. It'll have some impact, sure, but probably not much of one. And that is a pessimistic point of view. But I think that for me, the only way to actually affect change is to have that, to go deep into the pessimism, because then if you do that, I think what might happen is a dialectical reversal. You'll start to, pessimism will turn into its opposite. It's almost like pessimism is the new optimism. If you get pessimistic enough, and that pessimism doesn't just put you into a pit of nihilism, and instead it motivates you to, change things in some kind of substantive way, then things might change in some kind of substantive way. You might actually have something to be optimistic about, but the only way to get there is to go through this tunnel of pessimism.
Yeah.
Ultimately. And I've had a really hard time, I think, selling this to anybody, but it seems like it makes sense to me.
So as a fellow dialectical pessimist or revolutionary dialectical pessimist or whatever I definitely am very much in this camp. Mm-hmm. This is, I would say, the best general description of my almost existential phenomenological orientation to the world in general that I have yet found. So it's a good thing we're doing the show together, because there's a lot of sympathy, I think. But I would ask you, because this is something I'm always curious about. Why do you think that's such a hard sell?
Oh, that's a great question. So kind of a compound answer here. One, I think that from a very young age, we are trained, to look at things a certain way. And it's this makes me think of Antonio Gramsci, right? And the prison notebooks here. There's things, he's in prison in fascist Italy, looking out and going like, fascism? Like, for real? Italy? Fascism? Like, why are you doing, like, can you not, but what I get from him, one of the things I get from him is this idea, that certain things are just kind of presented to you as normal, and people soak that up, right? They just soak up what, when you grow up in a family, if there's a lot of yelling is normal for you. You don't think it's weird, Yeah. If you grow up in a family where there's like no yelling is extremely weird, to you. And that's, we don't pick it, the other precedes us. We're born into a world, we're thrown into it without any say in the conditions that we find ourselves contained within. And because of the conditions we find ourselves contained within, there's going to be certain things that are just seen as that's the way that things are, because it is. And people don't even think to ask a question, usually, about if those things that are so normative are actually good or bad or anything. They just sort of like take it and run with it. One of those things, I think, is this idea that you should be positive, that you should try to engage the world without being like an Eeyore, right? Like that's bad to do that. Like Eeyore is not good. You shouldn't be Eeyore. Eeyore's the thing that you want to always avoid being, or Eeyore is a cautionary tale and all that. And it takes somebody, for me, like Mark Fisher was a great example of this, to kind of like really point this stuff out, to be like, now hold on a second. I'm going to describe this process of being a pessimist, right? And kind of describe what that is and why I am one. And how I see pessimism being a useful thing, to affect meaningful change, to go like, oh wow, it's one of those things. There's a psychoanalyst, Christopher Bolos, writes about this in a book called The Shadow of the Object. He calls them unthought knowns. They're these things that but you never think them, right? You never actually put them in the symbolic register. You don't write them down. You don't say them to another person. They're there. But since they've never been symbolized, you can't do much with them. And so I think that when they do get symbolized or crystallized, into something that people can actually consider, that opens up possibilities. But when you do that, when you perform the action of rendering those sorts of revolutionary pessimistic ideas in the symbolic, and you expose people to that, they're going to be taken aback. It's going to be very foreign, and because it's like you get in the shower, and for whatever reason the hot water doesn't work, and you're just like blasted by cold water. It's like I didn't see that coming. Oh my God. And it's uncomfortable. And so the natural reaction, I think, is to back away from it and to try to reestablish comfort as quickly as you possibly can. But maybe if that wakes you up and kind of go, you have the option then to go like, oh, maybe I do want to engage with this, even though it's uncomfortable. Foucault is one of those people in the same way, right? When I read certain things by Foucault, it doesn't make me feel great, right? It makes me feel awkward and strange, and not in a good way. And it would be one thing I can do in those situations is I can put it down. You know what I mean? Just disengage and think about something else or read a different thing or go eat a bagel. I could do so many other things at that point.
Yeah.
But because I think, I've been fortunate enough to have really great people in my life who encourage me to kind of like lean into that when I experience it. It's something that I've gotten better at over time. And I think that that's a big part of what I'm trying to do in my own work right now is to kind of get people to develop that muscle a little bit more so that when they do encounter those sorts of things that they find off-putting or difficult, that they're able to not just disengage and run away from them and then never go back, right? Develop the capacities to re-engage with the things that make you uncomfortable. But of course, that means it's being uncomfortable. I think that one of the ways that I've had some success with it, not being as tough a sell, is likening it to things like exercise, right? Mm-hmm. The idea being that if you're going to exercise and get something out of it, that you're going to have to, put your body through things that it's not going to enjoy, that it's going to find difficult, and you're going to be sore if you do it the next day. But there's a benefit to that, right? And that's why you continue to engage in that. And I think the same thing can happen if we engage pessimism with that kind of a mindset. So I don't know if that actually answered the question or not. I feel like I just sort of rambled a lot, but hopefully there's something meaningful
it was good.
There.
Actually, this is such a potent topic, I guess. I would say that, a couple of things for me, I think really stand out whenever we start talking about this as like a general orientation to, not just like politics, but to me, it's like, I have a hard time talking about this without also being like very, very personal about it, because this is something I've wrestled with a lot in my life, because I think this sort of general orientation for me, it has a huge impact and sway on the actual like day-to-day relationships that I have in my life, whether romantic or with friendships or with colleagues and other like social workers or whatever it might be. God, there's like so many places that go with this. I guess I would start here. To me, I think that one of the reasons why this is such a challenging position to take is it has to do with the ghost of capital as we know it that haunts us in terms of identity formation. Mm-hmm. I think that most of us, what we're trained in, the general relations of capitalism that we grow up in, that is sort of this, what was the phrase, like this unthought known? Yeah. Is that there's this injunction that the whole center point, the whole sort of center of gravity around your identity should be a sense of enjoyment. And whether this is with relationships or how you consume or whatever it is, there's this idea that I am not actually living my life unless I'm enjoying it. Mm-hmm. And I think that to approach a sort of dialectical pessimistic sort of position, I'm going to draw on some of my own therapeutic work here, because I focus on what's called emotion focused therapy. And I have like a really strong psychoanalytic and attachment sort of approach to how I do my work. But there's this phrase that has to do with dealing with sort of unprocessed or unsymbolized trauma. Mm-hmm. And the phrase is that if you want to leave somewhere, you have to arrive there first. And I think that what this injunction to enjoy does is it sort of becomes a censor around the deeply core sort of terror and fear and like deep sadness and anger that I think most of us feel. And we know it's there because it doesn't take a lot to look around the world today with the access to information and feel that, holy shit, the planet is careening towards the brink. And what am I going to do about that? Mm-hmm. And I think that it has this sort of effect of pushing us to concede to that injunction to enjoy even more, right? That at least I know I can enjoy these next few moments. At least I know that this one person's life, I made a difference. Now, to be clear, like trying to be dialectical about this, I think that's something that has to be worked through and isn't something to also just be completely like disavowed or completely rejected. But to me, I think that whenever I try to figure out for myself, why did I come to this particular position? Yeah, I would say two things. One, the study of the history of 19th, 20th century, as much as I've been able to do that, makes me have a hard time not looking at that and just seeing the catastrophic wreckage of many, many things. And to me, I don't understand how you can look at history and not at least have to stare that into the face. And for me, that's sort of the introduction of the pessimism, is to just realistically look at that and say the catastrophe of that is just completely overwhelming and almost even hard to think about. Mm-hmm. And I also know that if we're going to do anything that isn't just going to return to some sort of like melancholic, deeply libidinal, sort of perverse attachment to these old ideas that have long since died, that we have to arrive at that, of the understanding of the catastrophic wreckage as it exists. I think we have to start there. And I think that a lot of the folks that I've organized with and that I've encountered day to day, I either see a sort of pure abandoning yourself to this injunction to enjoy, or I see a sort of a return to this past, and almost like, it's kind of almost like in The Shining, whenever Nicholson's character, like he concedes to the ghost of the past. He sort of becomes completely lost in this fantasy of that. And I think that's what I see a lot, is like, it's sort of this one or the other. I think it's very difficult to stay in that sort of realm of pessimism, even if it's not dialectical, but just to arrive at the pessimism first, because the idea that you have to now contend with this feeling of powerlessness, of being so small in this huge historical trajectory, I think that's terrifying. I think it provokes anxiety. And in terms of my own personal life, without going into a lot of the details, part of the reason why I got into social work and why I focus on working with survivors of violence and trauma is because I have a lot of that in my own background. And, there's this strange sort of like dialectical idea that the exposure to trauma brings pain and suffering. And it also brings a particular way of seeing the world that you just don't get access to without encountering trauma that directly. And to me, sometimes I'm not really sure if I'm a dialectical revolutionary pessimist or whatever because of like the political theory and history, or if it's because of my own background gives me a predisposition to these things. I'm sure it's some weird combination of both, which, I'm coming to terms with. But I guess at the end of the day, I don't know. There's that feeling of the ungroundedness, right? It's like it makes everything strange. It makes everything hard to understand or know what to do with. And I don't necessarily think it wins you a lot of friends either. I also know that to me, I don't know how to do anything else at this point. So it's a bit of a long answer, but it's kind of the best one I have. All right, y'all, that does it for this week on Red Library. Thanks for joining us. Big shout out to Comrade Neil, our new podcasting comrade in arms, battling our way through the leftosphere. One of the coolest things that has come out of us doing this show over the last 10 or 11 months or so has been whenever you, our excellent comrade listeners, reach out and let us know what you're thinking, sharing your ideas, your thoughts, and hell, maybe even your podcast, so we can start collaborating and building some bonds of solidarity, eliminating competition between leftist podcasters, trying to subvert the commodification of media, trying to subvert the social capital that we're all commodifying ourselves as, trying to get more likes, more listens. That shit's all fine and good, I guess. But really, at the end of the day, we're about solidarity on this show. Make no mistake about that. All right, we're going to see you back here next week. Remember, please keep supporting the show. Give us those iTunes reviews. Find our Patreon page if you want to kick over a few bucks our way. Help us buy some books. Keep the show up and running. Pay for our distribution costs and all that other nonsense. Maybe in the communist future, past the utopian horizon, everyone will have a podcast. That'll be great. Like 10 billion podcasts from each according to their podcasting ability, to each according to their podcasting need. God, what a nightmarish future that might be. Maybe we'll pack it in at that point because our job will be done. Let us hope. Let us dream, comrades. Until next week, stay hydrated, keep dreaming, keep fighting, keep subverting the commodification of yourself, of your forms of resistance, critically challenge the social relations of capital, and really, just stay alive out there, comrades. Find the others. Reach out. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to bring you every week. Take care of yourselves. Red Library out. We'll see you next week. Peace.